The year was 1887 when White Cliff Orphanage first opened its doors on the rugged, wind-battered shores of New England. For generations, it stood as a symbol of charity and compassion, a grand Victorian mansion repurposed to shelter children who had no home to call their own. The townsfolk viewed it with a complicated blend of pity and pride. Pity for the abandoned souls confined within its drafty halls, and pride that their community took responsibility for those most in need. But as with many places left to operate unchecked, shadows began to creep behind its stone walls. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've served as a detective with the Massachusetts State Police for over 15 years. What I'm about to reveal comes from an investigation that began in the fall of 1956, the year White Cliff was officially closed after nearly 7 decades of service. The public explanation was that the building had grown too unstable to safely house children. But those of us who were there know that was a lie. What we uncovered in its basement would haunt even the most hardened investigator. It all began with a phone call on a stormy October morning. The voice on the line was Marjorie Winters, the newly appointed director tasked with overseeing the orphanage's shutdown and the relocation of its last residents. Her tone was shaky as she explained that workers clearing out the basement archives had stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. A hidden compartment behind a bookshelf containing dozens of leather-bound journals. "Detective Blackwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think you need to see this. Some of the entries, they're not right. Something terrible happened here." I arrived at White Cliff the following morning. The imposing Victorian structure stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, its weathered gray stones seeming to absorb the weak autumn sunlight rather than reflect it. Miss Winters met me at the entrance, her thin frame almost lost in the oversized coat she wore against the coastal chill. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I've kept everything as it was found." She led me through the main hall, a cavernous space with a grand staircase that curved upward toward the dormitories. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of children, rows upon rows of solemn faces staring back through time. A few workers moved about packing crates and dismantling furniture. The remaining 23 children had been temporarily relocated to a sister facility in the neighboring town. "While the closure preceded you this way," Miss Winters said, leading me down a narrow corridor that ended at a heavy oak door. "The basement archives." The air grew noticeably colder as we descended the stone steps into the basement. The smell of mildew and old paper hung thick in the air. At the bottom, a long room stretched before us, lined with metal shelving units containing box after box of records. "The journals were found here," she said, pointing to a bookshelf that had been pulled away from the wall, revealing a small door built into the stonework behind it. The maintenance man discovered it by accident when he was checking for structural damage. I crouched down to examine the hidden compartment. It was approximately 3 foot square, just large enough to contain the stack of journals that now sat on a nearby table. 37 in total, each one bound in dark leather with a number embossed in gold on the spine. "Have you read them all?" I asked. Miss Winters shook her head. "Only a few entries, enough to know that we needed to contact the authorities." I picked up the journal marked 31, the one she had specifically mentioned on the phone. The leather was cracked with age, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. I opened to the first entry dated September 3rd, 1912. September 3rd, 1912. "Today marks my 5th year as director of White Cliff Orphanage. The Board of Trustees has expressed their continued satisfaction with my management, particularly regarding the reduction in operating expenses. Little do they know the true nature of these reductions. If they were to discover our arrangement with the Hargrove Society, I suspect their Christian sensibilities would be most offended. But then again, these are men who have never had to make difficult choices to ensure the survival of an institution such as this. We received 2 new children today, siblings, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. Their parents were lost at sea, or so the story goes. The boy, William, seems bright enough, but the girl, Anna, has not spoken a word since their arrival. Dr. Lancaster believes it to be shock from the trauma. I see potential in her silence. I looked up at Miss Winters, whose face had gone pale. "The Hargrove Society. Do you know what that is?" She shook her head. I've never heard of it, but there's more. Keep reading. I turned the page. September 10th, 1912. Mr. Hargrove visited today under the pretense of a charitable donation. We discussed the new arrivals in my office while the other children were at their lessons. He expressed particular interest in Anna, commenting on her unique quality. I knew what he meant. Some children have it, others don't. That certain something that makes them valuable to the society. Anna has it in abundance. The terms were negotiated. 6 months of operational funding in exchange for Anna when the time comes. It's a better arrangement than we usually secure. Typically, the exchange only covers 3 months of expenses, but Mr. Hargrove seemed especially keen on this one. William will pose a problem, of course. Siblings are always complicated. We'll need to separate them gradually. Prepare the boy for eventual disappointment. Miss Pembroke has been instructed to begin the process, assigning them to different dormitories, scheduling their meals and lessons at alternate times. By the time the exchange occurs, William will have almost forgotten he had a sister at all. The cold of the basement seemed to intensify as I read. My fingers traced the careful script, the methodical documentation of something unspeakable. This can't be real, I muttered, though I knew from my years of investigation that the most horrific crimes were often recorded with just such detached precision. There's an entry from March, Miss Winters said quietly. Page 76. That's the one that made me call you. I flipped through the journal until I found the date she mentioned. March 1913. We traded Anna yesterday. The exchange took place after midnight as is customary. Mr. Hargrove arrived with 2 of his associates and the usual black carriage. No markings, no windows. Anna went quietly. We had been administering the tincture in her evening tea for the past week, so she was quite docile. William was given a stronger dose to ensure he remained asleep throughout. The funds have been deposited in the orphanage account. We should be comfortable until September, at which point we will need to assess our current inventory for the next exchange. Miss Pembroke has suggested the Thompson girl who possesses similar qualities to Anna. I'll observe her more closely in the coming weeks. Dr. Lancaster has prepared the necessary documentation showing Anna's death from scarlet fever. The small grave in the children's cemetery will contain the appropriate weight of stones and earth. William was informed this morning of his sister's passing. He wept, of course, but children are remarkably resilient. By summer, his grief will have faded to a dull memory. The Board of Trustees has approved my request for new bedding in the girls' dormitory, such as the price of running a respectable orphanage in these difficult times. My hand was shaking by the time I finished reading. Have you checked the cemetery records? I asked. Miss Winters nodded. There's a record for Anna Matthews, died March 14th, 1913. Cause of death, scarlet fever. And what about William? Is there any record of what happened to him? She pulled a folder from beneath the stack of journals. I had the staff pull his file. According to the records, William Matthews was adopted by a family from Boston in October 1913, 7 months after his sister's death. There's an address listed, but it's from over 40 years ago. I closed the journal and looked at the others on the table. And these, do they all contain similar accounts? I've only skimmed a few, but yes, different children, different years, but the same pattern. Children being selected, prepared, and then traded. Always with the same clinical detachment, always with false records created to cover their disappearance. I picked up the earliest journal marked with a 1 on its spine. The first entry was dated April 1889, just 2 years after the orphanage opened. The latest journal, number 37, contained entries up to 1947. Almost 60 years, I said, feeling the weight of what that meant. If what's written here is true, this orphanage has been trafficking children for nearly 6 decades. But trafficking them where? And for what purpose? Miss Winters asked, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. It was the question I had been avoiding, the one that lurked at the edges of my consciousness. The journals documented the selection and preparation of children, the exchanges, the cover-ups, but never explicitly stated what happened to the children after they were taken. I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. I need to take these journals as evidence, and I'll need to speak with anyone who worked here during these years, especially in the 1940s when the last entries were written." Miss Winters nodded. "Most of the staff from that era are gone now, either retired or deceased. But there is one, Martha Shelby. She worked as a nurse here from 1939 until just last year. She lives in town in a small cottage near the harbor. I'll need to speak with her immediately," I said, carefully gathering the journals. "And in the meantime, I want the children's cemetery examined. If what these journals suggest is true, those graves may not contain what the headstones claim. The implications were almost too terrible to contemplate. How many children had disappeared into those black windowless carriages over the decades? How many false graves stood in the small cemetery on the orphanage grounds? And most importantly, what was the Hargrove Society, and what had they wanted with these children?" As I packed the journals into my car, the autumn wind howled off the Atlantic, carrying with it the distant cries of seagulls. I glanced back at White Cliff Orphanage, its stone walls and tall windows suddenly sinister in the fading afternoon light. For nearly 70 years, it had stood as a respected institution, praised for its charitable work. Now I knew it had harbored a darkness beyond imagination. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, that the journals of White Cliff Orphanage would lead me down a path so twisted, so steeped in horror that it would challenge not only my understanding of human depravity, but of reality itself. Martha Shelby's cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane, its weathered shingles and smoke-curling chimney, giving it the appearance of a fairy tale dwelling. But as I approached, I felt none of the comfort such an image should evoke. The journals in my briefcase seemed to grow heavier with each step. She answered after my second knock, a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face a map of fine wrinkles. Sharp blue eyes appraised me from behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Shelby, I'm Detective Thomas Blackwood. I was hoping I might speak with you about your time at White Cliff Orphanage." Something flickered in those blue eyes. Recognition perhaps, or fear, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a practiced smile. "Of course, Detective, please come in. I've just put the kettle on." The interior of the cottage was meticulously kept, every surface dusted, every cushion plumped. The walls were adorned with landscape paintings and faded photographs. One caught my eye, a group portrait of staff members standing on the steps of White Cliff, dated 1941. That was taken during the war, Mrs. Shelby said, following my gaze as she set out teacups on a small table. Times were difficult then. So many children left without families. I sat across from her, placing my briefcase on the floor beside me. "Mrs. Shelby, I'll be direct. We've discovered some disturbing documents at White Cliff. Journals that suggest children were being removed from the orphanage under suspicious circumstances." The teacup rattled slightly in her hand before she studied it. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Detective." I opened my briefcase and removed journal number 31, the one containing the entries about Anna. These journals were found hidden in the basement archives. They detail something called the Hargrove Society and describe children being traded over a period of decades. Martha Shelby's complexion went ashen. For a moment, I thought she might faint. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I never thought they would be found," she whispered. "They were supposed to remain hidden forever." My pulse quickened. "Then you know about them, about what happened to these children." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cottage walls. "I was young when I started at White Cliff, just 22. The war had begun, and I wanted to do something meaningful. Caring for orphan children seemed noble." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Director Blackwood, no relation to you, I presume, was in charge then. A stern man, but respected. It was 3 months before I noticed anything unusual. Children would occasionally disappear, always with some explanation. Adopted, transferred to another facility, or tragically deceased. The paperwork was always in order." "But you suspected something," I prompted. "Not at first. It wasn't until I found Eliza crying in the linen closet that I began to question things. Eliza Wilson, she was one of the older girls, 14 at the time. Her younger brother, Timothy, had supposedly died of pneumonia the week before. I found her hiding, clutching a small wooden toy that had belonged to him. Martha's voice trembled slightly. She told me that Timothy hadn't been sick at all, that she had seen him the night before his death, and he had been perfectly fine. She said the director had taken a special interest in him, had him brought to his office several times in the preceding weeks. I opened the journal to an entry from November 1941. November 18th, 1941. Timothy Wilson was exchanged tonight. The society paid handsomely, enough to see us through the winter and into spring. His qualities were exceptional, precisely what Mr. Hargrove has been seeking. The sister poses a risk. She asks too many questions. Nurse Shelby has been instructed to administer increased doses of sedative in the girl's evening medicine. If her suspicious nature persists, we may need to consider more permanent solutions. That I looked up from the page to find Martha Shelby weeping silently. I didn't know then, she said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, but I started paying attention, watching, listening. There were patterns. Certain children would catch the director's eye. Usually the quiet ones, the special ones, children with unusual talents or traits. They would be given special attention for weeks or months, and then they would vanish, always with some plausible explanation. And you never reported this to anyone? I asked, trying to keep the accusation from my voice. She laughed bitterly. To whom? Detective? The board of trustees? They were complicit, or at least willfully ignorant. The local police. The orphanage was the largest employer in town. Its director a respected community leader. Besides, there was never any evidence, only suspicions. What about the Hargrove Society? What do you know about them? At this, Martha Shelby rose shakily from her chair and moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a small leather-bound book, not a journal, but what appeared to be a personal diary. After Eliza's revelation, I began keeping my own record, observations, conversations overheard, names of children who disappeared. I never witnessed an exchange myself, but over time I pieced together fragments of information about the society. She handed me the diary with trembling fingers. They're old, ancient, some say, a secret organization that has existed for centuries under various names. What they want with the children, I cannot say with certainty. There were whispers among the staff. Terrible whispers. I opened the diary, scanning the neat handwriting that filled its pages. Martha had indeed been meticulous in her documentation, dates, names, circumstances of disappearance. But more disturbing were her notes on the Hargrove Society itself. December 12, 1941. Overheard director speaking with Dr. Lancaster about the ritual. Mentioned something about the changing and vessels. Lancaster seemed disturbed but did not object. February 3, 1942. Cook says black carriage came again last night. No windows, no markings, same as before. Says she once glimpsed the driver, claimed his face was not right, whatever that means. April 17, 1942. Eliza found dead this morning. Official cause, suicide by hanging, but her hands were bruised and there was a strange mark on her neck that didn't match the rope. Director ordered immediate burial. No autopsy. May 30th, 1942. Groundskeeper Jenkins, drunk tonight, told me he's been digging empty graves for years. Just rocks and dirt, he said. When I asked where the children really went, he said only to the deep places where the old ones wait. I closed the diary, a chill running through me despite the warmth of the cottage. Mrs. Shelby, this suggests something beyond ordinary human trafficking. She nodded, her face grave. I believe the Hargrove Society is not what it seems, detective. Not simply criminals, but something else. Something older and more terrible than we can comprehend. Why didn't you leave? Why stay for all those years if you suspected such horrors? To watch, to record, to try in my small way to protect those I could. Her voice hardened. And to gather evidence, though I never found enough to bring them down. The director was careful, the society even more so. Their operations were conducted with clinical precision. I glanced back at her diary. You mentioned a groundskeeper. Jenkins. Is he still alive? Martha shook her head. Found drowned in the bay in 43. Another suicide. Anyone who knew too much or spoke too freely tended to meet unfortunate ends. And the director from that period, Dr. Lancaster. Director Blackwood died in 1947. Heart attack supposedly. Dr. Lancaster left shortly after, relocated to a private practice in Boston. I lost track of him after that. I made notes of these names, determined to follow every possible lead. Mrs. Shelby, I'll need your diary as evidence, and I may have more questions as the investigation proceeds. She nodded, a certain resignation in her gesture. Take it, but be careful, detective. The society has existed for generations. They have connections in places you wouldn't expect. Government, law enforcement, judiciary. If they discover you're investigating them, I appreciate your concern, I said, rising to leave. But if what these journals describe is true, dozens, perhaps hundreds of children were taken from White Cliff over the decades. I need to find out what happened to them, no matter the risk. As I reached the door, Martha Shelby called after me. Detective, there's one more thing you should know. The exchanges followed a pattern. Always at the dark of the moon, always children with particular qualities. The staff had a name for them, the marked ones. Marked how? Not physically, at least not in any way visible to ordinary eyes. But they were different. Children who saw things others couldn't, who knew things they shouldn't. Children who spoke of dreams where they walked in places that don't exist. The director could identify them somehow. He called it the shadow on their souls. I left Martha Shelby's cottage with more questions than answers. My mind reeling from implications too bizarre to fully process. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss her more outlandish claims as the fantasies of an old woman burdened by guilt. But the journals provided tangible evidence that children had indeed been traded from White Cliff Orphanage for decades. The next morning, I contacted the state police headquarters and requested a team to investigate the children's cemetery at White Cliff. By noon, 6 officers and a forensic specialist were carefully excavating the small plot of land behind the orphanage, where generations of children had supposedly been laid to rest. It took 3 days to confirm what Martha Shelby's diary had suggested. The graves were empty, or rather, they contained no human remains, only stones and earth carefully weighted to approximate the heft of a child's body. 47 graves in total, each one a silent testament to an elaborate deception that had spanned nearly 7 decades. While the excavation proceeded, I turned my attention to tracking down any leads on the Harrove Society. The name appeared in none of the usual records, no business registrations, no property deeds, no tax filings. It was as if the organization existed only in the pages of the White Cliff journals and Martha Shelby's diary. But one name did yield results. Dr. Philip Lancaster. After leaving White Cliff in 1947, he had indeed established a private practice in Boston specializing in pediatric medicine. The practice had closed in 1962 following Lancaster's death from stroke. His widow, however, was still alive, residing in a nursing home in Cambridge. Eleanor Lancaster was 92 years old, her once sharp mind now clouded by the advance of dementia. The nursing staff warned me that her lucidity came and went, that she often confused past and present. But it was a risk I had to take. She might be the last living link to the inner workings of White Cliff during those critical years. I found her in the sunroom, a thin figure wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the day, staring out at the garden beyond the windows. Mrs. Lancaster, I'm Detective Blackwood. I'd like to ask you about your husband's work at White Cliff Orphanage. She turned slowly, roomy eyes narrowing as she studied my face. For a moment, there was no recognition, no understanding. Then something shifted in her expression. You found the journals, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. Philip said someone would eventually. I sat beside her, keeping my voice low. Yes, Mrs. Lancaster. We found the journals and we know about the children who were taken. I'm trying to understand what happened to them. A sad smile played across her withered lips. My husband was a good man, detective, a man of science. He believed he was helping to advance human knowledge to push back the boundaries of the unknown. But in the end, he couldn't reconcile his conscience with what he had witnessed. And what was that exactly? The society is ancient, you know. They've gone by many names throughout history. The Brotherhood of the Abyss, the Watchers at the Threshold, the Keepers of the Veil. Harrove is just their most recent incarnation. I felt a familiar skepticism rise within me. Perhaps the nursing staff had been right about her mental state. Mrs. Lancaster, I'm interested in concrete information about what happened to the children from White Cliff. Of course you are, she said, patting my hand with gnarled fingers. So practical, so grounded in your perception of reality. Philip was the same at first, a man of medicine, of empirical evidence, until he saw what became of little David Peterson. The name struck a chord. I had read about David in journal number 35, a 7-year-old boy described as having exceptional sensitivity to the unseen world. According to the entry, he had been exchanged in February 1946. What happened to David? I asked. They took him to the house on Beacon Hill. That's where the initial transformations occurred. Philip was invited to observe. It was a rare honor. They told him the society typically kept their rituals private, but they wanted a medical perspective on the physical changes. She shuddered at the memory. He came home different that night. Wouldn't speak of what he'd seen. Not at first. It took months before he told me, and even then I thought it was some kind of nervous breakdown. The things he described couldn't possibly be real. What things, Mrs. Lancaster? Her voice dropped to a whisper. The children were vessels, detective preparations for something ancient to inhabit. The society believed that certain children, special children, had minds particularly receptive to hosting. Hosting what? I asked, though a part of me didn't want to hear the answer. They called them the Old Ones, entities that existed before humanity, before Earth itself. Beings of immense power that exist primarily in dimensions adjacent to our own, unable to fully manifest in our reality without a suitable vessel. The society has served them for centuries, providing them with carefully prepared hosts. I fought to keep my expression neutral. The rational part of my mind dismissed her words as delusion. Yet something deeper, some primal instinct, resonated with a terrible certainty. Mrs. Lancaster, are you saying these children were possessed? She laughed. A hollow, brittle sound. Such a quaint term, detective. It implies something temporary, something that could be exorcised or driven out. No, this was more fundamental. A complete transformation of the vessel, body, and soul into something neither human nor entirely other. A perfect melding that allowed the Old Ones to experience our world directly. And your husband witnessed this. He witnessed the beginning of it, the initial joining. It was enough to haunt him for the rest of his life. Her fingers plucked restlessly at her shawl. He left the society after that, refused to participate further. We moved frequently in the years that followed, always looking over our shoulders. Philip kept journals of his own, detailed accounts of everything he had learned about the society and their practices. He wanted there to be a record in case. In case what, Mrs. Lancaster? In case they succeeded, she whispered. Their ultimate goal wasn't simply to provide vessels for individual Old Ones. It was to prepare the way for something larger. The return of all the Old Ones, the reshaping of our world into one more suitable for their existence. I leaned forward. These journals your husband kept. Where are they now? Hidden. After his death, I concealed them as he instructed. The location is, she frowned, confusion clouding her features. I can't remember. It's been so long. Please, Mrs. Lancaster. It's important. Lives may depend on it. She closed her eyes, concentrating. There was a key and a storage facility in his name, but not his real name. The name he used was... Suddenly, her eyes flew open wide with fear. They're here, she hissed, clutching my arm with surprising strength. They found us. I glanced around the sunroom, seeing only other elderly residents and staff. Who's here, Mrs. Lancaster? Don't look directly at them. They'll know. Her voice was urgent, trembling. The society has eyes everywhere. People who appear human but aren't. Not anymore. They've been watching me for years, waiting for someone like you to come asking questions. A chill ran down my spine despite the rational part of my mind dismissing her paranoia. Mrs. Lancaster, we're safe here. No one is watching us. The orderly who just passed by the door. She whispered. Did you notice his eyes? how they reflect the light wrongly. And the nurse at the station, she's been there too long. Hasn't moved once since you arrived. They're Sentinel's detective, the changed ones. I humored her, glancing casually toward the nurse's station. The woman there was indeed remarkably still, her attention seemingly fixed on her paperwork, as if sensing my gaze. She looked up suddenly, our eyes meeting across the room. For a fraction of a second, so briefly I might have imagined it. Something shifted in her face, a subtle wrongness that defied description. You need to go, Eleanor Lancaster urged. Find Philip's journals. The storage facility was in Portsmouth, Harborview Storage, under the name Richard Marsh. The key is hidden in our old house in Boston, 1147 Commonwealth Avenue, behind the loose brick in the fireplace. If the house still stands, if the new owners haven't found it. Her voice trailed off as a nurse approached, smiling pleasantly. Time for your medication, Mrs. Lancaster. Eleanor's grip on my arm tightened. Don't trust anyone, detective. They've had decades to spread their influence. The children they took, the ones who were successfully transformed. They walk among us now, holding positions of power and authority. They look human. They act human, but they serve the old ones. The nurse's smile remained fixed as she administered Eleanor's medication. She gets quite imaginative in the afternoons, she told me. All sorts of fantastic stories. I understand, I said, rising to leave. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Lancaster. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced back. Eleanor's eyes were on me, pleading and fearful. The nurse stood beside her, one hand resting on the old woman's shoulder. As I watched, the nurse leaned down and whispered something in Eleanor's ear, something that made the elderly woman go rigid with terror. I left the nursing home with Eleanor Lancaster's warnings echoing in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss her account as the ramblings of a dementia patient. Yet the specificity of certain details gave me pause. The storage facility in Portsmouth, the key hidden in the fireplace of her former home, these were concrete leads that could be verified. More troubling was my own reaction to the nurse at the station. Had I really seen something unusual in her face? Or was I allowing Eleanor's paranoia to influence my perception? I had been a detective long enough to trust my instincts, and something about the entire situation at Whitecliff Orphanage had felt wrong from the beginning. Not just criminally wrong, but wrong in a way that challenged my understanding of reality. I decided to pursue the lead in Boston first. The Lancasters' former home on Commonwealth Avenue was my best chance of finding the key to the storage unit where Philip Lancaster had supposedly hidden his journals. The house turned out to be a stately brownstone, now divided into luxury apartments. Through a combination of official credentials and careful questioning, I learned that the original fireplace in the main living room had been preserved in what was now the ground floor apartment occupied by a young professional couple. Explaining my presence as part of a historical preservation survey, I gained access to the apartment while its owners were at work. The fireplace was indeed original to the house, an ornate marble affair with intricate carvings. I examined the interior carefully, running my fingers along the bricks until I found one that shifted slightly under pressure. With a small pocket knife, I worked the brick free. Behind it was a small cavity containing a brass key attached to a tag with faded writing. Harborview Storage, Unit 17, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Eleanor Lancaster's information had been accurate. Whatever else she might have imagined, this key was real, and with it the possibility that her husband's journals existed as well. I drove to Portsmouth that same afternoon, the coastal highway providing views of the same Atlantic waters that crashed against the cliffs below Whitecliff Orphanage. Harborview Storage turned out to be an aging facility near the docks, its salt-weathered sign barely legible. The manager, a grizzled man in his 60s, examined the key with suspicion. Unit 17's been paid up through a trust account for hell must be 30 years now. Money comes in like clockwork every January. Never seen who owns it, though. The owner was Dr. Philip Lancaster, I explained, showing my credentials. I'm investigating a case related to his former employment. Has anyone accessed this unit recently? The manager checked his records. Not according to the log. Last entry was 1962. That's when the automatic payments started. Unit 17 was located at the far end of the facility. A padlocked door of corrugated metal that had clearly not been opened in decades. The lock was stiff with disuse, requiring considerable force to turn the key. When the door finally rolled upward, it revealed a space about 10 foot square containing a single object. A large steamer trunk secured with yet another padlock. "I'll need some privacy," I told the manager, who nodded and retreated to his office. The key that had opened the unit also fit the trunk's padlock. Inside, carefully packed and preserved in oilcloth, were 13 leather-bound journals, similar in appearance to those found at White Cliff, but with PL embossed on each cover rather than a number. I opened the first journal, dated 1941, the year Philip Lancaster began working at White Cliff Orphanage, September 15, 1941. "I have accepted the position of medical officer at White Cliff Orphanage, beginning next month. The salary is modest, but Director Blackwood has hinted at additional compensation for what he calls special research opportunities. He was vague about the nature of this research, mentioning only that it involves children with unusual neurological or psychological profiles. Given my interest in developmental psychology, this could be a fascinating opportunity. Ella Lehner is pleased that we'll be moving to the coast. The sea air will be good for her health, and the proximity to Boston means we won't be entirely removed from civilization." The early entries were mundane. Observations about the orphanage, the children, the staff. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift. November 3rd, 1941. Director Blackwood introduced me to Mr. Hargrove today. An unusual man, tall, gaunt, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Eastern European, perhaps. He asked detailed questions about my medical background and seemed particularly interested in my research on childhood development. Hargrove represents a private research foundation. According to Blackwood, they provide substantial funding to the orphanage in exchange for access to certain children for study. The arrangement struck me as ethically questionable, but Blackwood assured me all proper protocols are followed. The children selected for study are those with no prospects for adoption, the older ones, or those with behavioral issues that make them unsuitable for placement with families. Still, something about Hargrove unsettled me. There was a coldness in his eyes when he spoke of the children as if they were specimens rather than human beings. The entries continued in this vein, documenting Lancaster's growing unease with the arrangement between White Cliff and the Hargrove Society. By early 1942, his suspicions had deepened. February 17, 1942. I can no longer ignore the irregularities at White Cliff. Children selected for the Hargrove Foundation studies invariably disappear within months. The official records show adoptions or transfers to other facilities, but my inquiries to these supposed destinations have been met with confusion or denial. When I questioned Director Blackwood about the discrepancies, he became defensive, reminding me of the confidentiality agreement I signed upon employment. "The Foundation's work is sensitive," he said, "for the greater good of humanity. Sometimes discretion requires creative documentation. I've begun keeping track of the children who catch Hargrove's attention. They share certain traits: unusual perceptiveness, vivid imaginations, what some might call sensitivity to the supernatural. Timothy Wilson was one such child. His sister's accusations of foul play were dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but I'm no longer certain they should have been." The journal entries grew increasingly disturbing as Lancaster documented his observations. He described midnight meetings in the director's office, strange chanting heard from the basement, children who spoke of visitors in their dreams, visitors who promised to take them to the deep places where they would be transformed. Then came the entry that changed everything. February 23, 1946. "Tonight, I witnessed something that has shattered my understanding of reality. After months of cautious investigation, I managed to follow Hargrove and his associates after they removed David Peterson from the orphanage. They took him to a mansion on Beacon Hill, an imposing structure of dark stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Using medical credentials and implying I had been invited, I gained entry to the house. The interior was opulent but strangely proportioned. Ceilings too high, doorways slightly wider than necessary, angles that seemed to bend in ways that disoriented the eye. In the basement, I found a gathering of robed figures surrounding a central altar where David lay. The boy was conscious but eerily calm, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above, which had been painted with a mural of swirling stars and strange geometries that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Hargrove led the ceremony, speaking in a language I've never heard, guttural and rhythmic with consonants that no human throat should be able to produce. As the chanting intensified, the air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Then it appeared, a shimmering in the air above David, a distortion that gradually took form. I cannot adequately describe what I saw. It was both present and not present, a suggestion of something vast compressed into a space too small to contain it. Tendrils of opalescent light extended from the shimmering mass toward the boy. When they made contact with his skin, David's body arched upward, hovering inches above the altar. His mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. Instead, the shimmering entity seemed to flow into him through his eyes, his mouth, his very pores. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. David's features shifted subtly, rearranging themselves into something that resembled him, but was fundamentally wrong. When his eyes opened again, they were not the eyes of a 7-year-old boy. Whatever looked out through those orbs was ancient beyond comprehension. Hargrove approached the altar and bowed deeply. "Welcome, honored one," he said. "Your vessel has been prepared as promised." And the thing that had been David Peterson sat up, movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if learning to operate unfamiliar machinery. When it spoke, the voice was a dissonant blend of child and something else, something that made the air vibrate painfully. "This vessel is acceptable," it said. "The alignment approaches. Prepare the next." I fled then, unable to bear witnessing more. By some miracle, my absence went unnoticed amidst the society's rapturous attention to their guest. What I have seen cannot be explained by any medical or scientific framework I know. Either I have gone mad or there exists alongside our reality something ancient and utterly alien. Something that views humanity as nothing more than potential vessels for habitation. I cannot continue my association with White Cliff.